Good morning. I want to thank the Academy for the opportunity to make the presentation of my paper by video. I regret that I am not able to be there in person to make this presentation. The conference theme, the restructuring of the global economy, implies that we are either currently in a process of being restructured and need to adapt, or that we have a desperate need to be restructured and must find ways to do so. I postulate in my paper that the United Nations has been attempting to restructure the global economy for the last 2 decades, from a capitalistic model to a more socialistic model, moving from market-driven approaches to the allocation of resources to non-market approaches to the allocation of resources and to consumption. For decades, the UN has struggled to maintain its relevance and influence among the nations of the world. In the early 90s, the UN found climate alarmism to be an effective tool in establishing its relevance and bringing the many nations under some semblance of its control. The precursor to climate alarmism was research in the early 70s that indicated world population that was rapidly increasing at a rate beyond which the Earth's capability to feed, house, and clothe the population as it grew. The UN tried to capitalize on this sense of impending world collapse by developing a plan for more sustainable growth, and they called that plan Agenda 21. Agenda 21 was a plan that called for sustainable development. It also wanted to slow population growth and redistribute wealth to the poorer nations. The key word, again, coming out of Agenda 21 was sustainable growth. The premise was that people in the industrialized world were consuming more than their fair share of the world's resources. In the middle of Agenda 21 document is a chapter devoted to protecting the atmosphere, and it addresses climate change. And it is language adopted from the UN Convention on Climate that had occurred 1 month prior to the Agenda 21 convention. Agenda 21 received somewhat lukewarm support of the nations, but the climate change aspect seemed to catch on more readily, and it became the focus of the UN for the next several decades, culminating in the Paris Climate Accord of 2015. After all, responsible nations and their leaders do not want to be regarded as not caring for the environment. But remarkably, the language of the Paris Accord is quite similar to that of Agenda 21, and we'll see that in a minute. As I said in my opening, I believe the UN is attempting to bring about global economic restructuring to minimize capitalism and institute a more socialistic framework. It is using climate alarmism as the vehicle to accomplish this. Why do I say this? Consider the statement by the former Secretary General of the UN Framework Committee on Climate Change. Quote, "This is the first time in the history of mankind that we are setting ourselves the task of intentionally, within a specified period of time, to change the economic development model that has been reigning for at least 150 years since the Industrial Revolution." End quote. It appears that, again, this was a purpose stated by the Secretary General. The following is quoted from Article 6, paragraph 8 and 9 of the Paris Agreement. Quote, "The parties recognize the importance of integrated, holistic, and balanced non-market approaches being available to parties to assist in the implementation of their nationally determined contributions in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication." Paragraph 9, quote, "A framework for non-market approaches to sustainable development is hereby defined to promote the non-market approaches referred to in paragraph 8 of this article," end quote. Of note in this quote is the term non-market approaches to sustainable development. In other words, government should be determining the allocation of resources and resource use rather than letting market forces make that determination. Also considering that sustainable growth embraces the idea that consumption patterns in the industrialized nations need to be changed, The non-market approaches to achieving sustainable growth would entail government controlling consumption patterns. That is, dictating what we consume, when we consume, etc. In other words, individual freedoms must be curtailed. To bring world leaders to the point of accepting the Paris Accord, the UN has managed to convince those leaders that scientists are unanimous in their belief that CO2 emissions by humans have exceeded what nature can absorb, and that those emissions are causing an abnormal warming of the Earth and its atmosphere, such that it is upsetting nature's balance. This imbalance in nature is causing climate to change in devastating ways, such that, if not checked, it threatens the collapse of life on this planet as we know it, or even the planet itself. The purpose of the Paris Accord was to get the nations of the world to cooperate in trying to stop or alleviate climate change by reducing emissions of CO2. This would entail the methods outlined to achieve sustainable growth, moving away from the use of fossil fuel energy to renewable fuel sources such as wind and solar, and to limit the use of CO2 emitting tools and processes. The wealthier nations of the world are expected to contribute billions of dollars a year to a UN fund that will be distributed to the poorer nations to help them accomplish the goals of the agreement. The problem is the Paris Accord commits the nations to embark on a process that could be very costly and devastating to strong economies when the accord is based on a false premise. There is no scientific consensus that humans are causing global climate change. There is no empirical evidence that links CO2 emissions to climate change. There is no empirical evidence that climate is getting worse. For at least a decade, the frequency and severity of hurricanes and tornadoes has been declining, as has the frequency and severity of world drought, rainfall, and other devastating weather events. The global average temperature has actually been flatlined or in a declining trend for the last 18 years. Polar ice caps were reported as retreating as far back as the early 1900s, well before the rise in CO2 held forth by UN scientists. Even now, polar ice caps are growing, and sea ice is growing faster and thicker. The seas are rising at the same level as they have been rising for centuries, about 7 inches per 100 years. The polar bear population is growing and thriving. It's not declining. So it appears the world leaders have accepted what they were told about global warming without actually investigating whether there is any substance to it. In simple language, they were conned. It is clear that Agenda 21 and the Paris Accord requires a significant restructuring of the economy. It is also clear that such restructuring was a primary goal of the UN. It is also clear that climate alarmism has played a significant role in getting the nations to sign the Paris Accord. And it might continue to play a significant role in keeping the Paris Accord from unraveling now that the US has pulled out. But what is not so clear is whether the restructuring of the global economy was the tool to halt global warming, or whether climate alarmism was merely the tool to bring about the restructuring of the economy. Given that the science behind climate change is very weak or non-existent, the latter is more likely. There is evidence that the UN continued to promote climate change alarmism when it knew its scientific data did not support such alarmism. The bottom line is climate does change, but by forces of nature not well understood by mankind. Climate is a very complex phenomenon, and it is ludicrous to think that we can simply control climate by tweaking atmospheric levels of CO2. CO2 is not a culprit. It's not a pollutant. It is essential for all life on this planet, and when you reduce CO2 levels, you reduce an essential ingredient plants need to survive and thrive. Plants provide us the food and materials for shelter and clothing. Reducing CO2 thus threatens the ability of the world to feed, shelter, and clothe its growing population. And there are also environmental problems with going to non-fossil fuels. For example, by 2050, it is estimated there will be 43 million tons of wind turbine blades that need to be disposed of. That's waste for the environment. A solar farm occupies approximately 3,500 acres to produce only about 350 megawatts of electricity, whereas a fossil fuel, a coal-burning generating plant occupies 50 acres and produces 1,000 megawatts of electricity. So there are issues with going to non-fossil fuels. It's more expensive, which in itself can devastate some of these poor economies. I hope you find this presentation informative. My paper gets into a little bit more detail. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or present them to the conference leaders. Thank you very much for your attention.